The day my children finally came back for the house was the day they learned they had lost something far more important. I was not there to see their faces, but I know exactly what happened because the woman who bought my home called me that afternoon, her voice trembling with confusion. I was sitting on the porch of a small cabin overlooking Flathead Lake in Montana when my phone rang. The mountains were covered in autumn colors. A soft breeze moved through the pine trees. I had a cup of coffee in my hand and nowhere I needed to be. That still felt strange after so many years. "Mrs. Hayes?" the woman asked nervously. "I hope I am not bothering you, but two people just showed up here. They said this was their mother's house." I smiled quietly and looked out across the water. "And what did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them my husband and I bought this place 6 months ago." They looked shocked. I closed my eyes for a second. Emily and Brian. My children. My babies. The two people I had spent my entire life loving. The two people who had not called me on my birthday for 9 years. The two people who somehow believed that the house would always be waiting for them. The woman hesitated. "Mrs. Hayes," they asked where you went. I told them I had no idea. I thanked her kindly and ended the call. Then I sat there for a long time. Not crying. Not angry. Just quiet. A seagull drifted across the lake. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing. I remember thinking how peaceful everything sounded. 9 years earlier, peace had been something I could not remember. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Laura Mitchell, my oldest friend. "Margaret," she said softly. "Emily just called me." I laughed quietly. "Really? She is upset." "I imagine she is." Laura was silent for a moment. She said she went by the house because Brian needed some paperwork and nobody answered the door. Then a strange woman opened it. I stared at the mountains. "Did she ask about me?" Laura paused. "No. She asked who bought the house." That answer should have hurt. Maybe once it would have. But something inside me had changed. "Did you tell her where I am?" I asked. "Of course not." I smiled. "Thank you." Laura sighed. "Margaret, they sound frightened." I looked down at the wedding ring I still wore even though Richard had been gone for 12 years. "Good," I whispered. Because for the first time in 9 years, they finally noticed I was missing. After we ended the call, I walked down to the dock. The air smelled clean. A bald eagle flew above the lake. I remember Richard telling me years ago that one day we would retire somewhere quiet. We never got that chance together. Life had different plans. But somehow, I made it here anyway. I sat down and watched the sunset turn the water gold. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was an unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something told me not to. I answered. A woman's voice broke through the silence. "Mom," Emily whispered. And for the first time in 9 years, my daughter finally remembered I existed. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. I held the phone in my hand and listened to the silence on the other end. Emily had always talked fast when she was nervous, even as a little girl. But now she sounded different. Older. Fragile. Almost like she was afraid I might disappear if she spoke too loudly. "Mom," she whispered again. I looked out across the lake. The sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains. "Hello, Emily," I said quietly. Then nothing. Just silence. I could hear her breathing. I could hear traffic somewhere near her. Finally, she spoke. "Mom, where are you?" I smiled sadly. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I enjoyed hearing fear in her voice. But because after 9 years, that was the first question she had asked that actually sounded like a daughter speaking to her mother. "I am fine," I answered. "Mom, Brian and I went by the house." I closed my eyes. Of course they did. "Did you?" I asked softly. "There are strangers living there." "Yes." "Mom, what happened?" I looked at the ring on my finger and thought about Richard. My husband had been gone 12 years. Sometimes I still expected him to walk through the front door and ask what was for dinner. Grief never really leaves. It just becomes quieter. "Life happened, sweetheart." Emily began crying. "Why did you not tell us?" I almost answered immediately. But I stopped. Because the truth was complicated. I did tell them. Not with words. With holidays spent alone. With unanswered phone calls. With birthdays nobody remembered. With empty chairs around the Thanksgiving table. "Mom," she asked again. "Where are you?" "Far away." She started crying harder. "Brian is here too. He wants to talk to you." I sat down slowly on the dock. "No, thank you." More silence. Then Emily whispered something that made my heart ache. "Mom, we thought you were angry." I laughed quietly. "Angry? Yes." "Emily, angry people call. Angry people yell. Angry people fight. I stopped doing all of those things years ago. Another silence. Then she asked the question I knew would come. How long? I watched a family of ducks moving across the water. 9 years. Her breathing stopped for a moment. No. Yes. It was not 9 years. Emily, you forgot my 70th birthday. Silence. You forgot Mother's Day 4 years in a row. More silence. You spent Thanksgiving in Florida with friends and never told me. I heard her crying. Mom, I am sorry. You forgot your father's birthday. That one hurt both of us. Richard had loved birthdays. He always made a big deal out of every occasion. Even after he became sick. Even during his last year. Emily sobbed softly. Mom, please stop. No, sweetheart. I am not trying to hurt you. I am just telling you what happened. Brian's voice suddenly came through the phone. Mom, where are you? I recognized his voice immediately. It had changed. Older. Tired. Hello, Brian. Mom, are you okay? I smiled sadly. Funny how children ask that after they realize you're gone. I am wonderful. He sounded confused. Wonderful. Yes. Mom, why did you leave? I looked at the sunset and whispered softly. Because I got tired of waiting for you to come home. Neither of them said a word after that. Then Brian quietly asked the question neither of them expected to ask. Mom, when did you stop needing us? I closed my eyes. Because the answer was something I had never planned on saying. The day I realized you had already stopped needing me. After Brian asked me that question, none of us spoke. I could hear Emily crying softly beside him. Somewhere in the background, a car door slammed. I imagined the two of them standing outside what used to be my home. Confused. Lost. Maybe even ashamed. I was not sure. I sat there on the dock with my feet resting above the water. The sky had turned dark blue and the first stars had started to appear. Mom, Brian whispered. Are you still there? I am here. Did we really hurt you that much? I smiled sadly. Not because he asked. Because after all these years, he finally wanted to know. No, sweetheart, I answered softly. You did not hurt me all at once. Neither of them said anything. It happened slowly. I closed my eyes and remembered Christmas 9 years earlier. I had decorated the tree exactly the way Richard liked it. White lights. Red ribbons. Homemade ornaments from when Emily and Brian were children. I cooked enough food for 6 people. I set the table with my good dishes. I even baked Brian's favorite pecan pie. Then I waited. 6 o'clock. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. Nobody came. Around 9, Emily texted. Merry Christmas, Mom. Sorry. Maybe next week. Brian never called. I ate alone. I wrapped leftovers and put them in the refrigerator. Then I washed 6 plates that nobody touched. Mom, Emily whispered through tears. I do not remember that. I know. Another memory came. Mother's Day. For years ago, I sat in church alone. Everyone else was surrounded by children and grandchildren. I smiled and told people my family was busy. After lunch, I went home and watered Richard's roses. My phone never rang. I checked it anyway. Every hour. Until bedtime. Nothing. Oh God, Emily whispered. Mom, I am sorry. I looked across the lake. Do you remember your father's birthday? Neither of them answered. That silence told me enough. I baked his favorite cake. I sat beside his photograph and talked to him. Then I watched an old movie by myself. Brian cleared his throat. Mom, why did you never tell us? I laughed softly. Tell you what? That you were lonely. Sweetheart, loneliness is not something you announce. People either notice or they do not. I heard Emily sobbing again. Mom, I thought you were okay. I know. You always sounded fine. Because I did not want to become a burden. Another silence. Then Brian spoke quietly. I called when I needed help with the kids. Yes. Emily called when she needed money. Yes. And you always said yes. Because I am your mother. His voice broke. Why? I looked at Richard's ring and smiled. Because your father and I promised each other we would always put you first. I paused. But somewhere along the way, both of you forgot that parents grow old too. Nobody spoke. Then Emily whispered something I had not heard in years. Mom, I miss Dad. Tears filled my eyes. So do I, sweetheart. More silence. Then Brian asked quietly. Mom, when did you decide to leave? I looked at the mountains and remembered the exact day. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted revenge. But because something happened that changed everything. Something neither of them even remembered. And when I finally answered, I heard Emily begin crying all over again. The day both of you forgot I was in the hospital. Neither of them spoke after I said those words. I could hear Emily crying. Brian sounded like he was trying to breathe. I sat quietly and let the silence do what silence sometimes does. It tells the truth better than anger ever can. Mom, Brian whispered. What hospital? I closed my eyes and remembered the smell of coffee in the waiting room. The bright lights. The sound of nurses talking softly. The old television nobody watched. St. Joseph's, I answered. 3 years ago. Another silence. No, Emily whispered. Mom, that cannot be right. It is. Why were you there? Because I fell in the kitchen and broke my wrist. Nobody spoke. Then Brian said something that made my heart ache. Why did you not call us? I smiled sadly. I did. Silence. I called both of you. Emily gasped. No. Twice. Brian started breathing harder. Mom, I never got any messages. Because you were on a cruise with your friends. More silence. Emily, you texted me and said you were busy at work. I remembered lying in that hospital bed. A kind nurse named Jessica brought me pudding and sat with me while I waited to go home. She asked if my family was coming. I smiled and told her they lived far away. That was easier than explaining. Mom, Emily whispered. I do not remember. I know. Tears rolled down my face. Not because I was angry. Because I remembered how lonely I felt that day. After I was discharged, Laura drove me home. She helped me into bed and made soup. She stayed the night because she worried I might fall again. She was not family, but she stayed. The next morning, Brian called. Not to ask how I was. He wanted to know if I could watch the children because his babysitter canceled. I said yes. Because mothers say yes. Emily called 2 days later. She needed help with her car payment. I sent her the money. Neither of them asked why I sounded tired. Neither of them noticed I could barely lift my arm. Mom, Brian whispered. Please stop. No, sweetheart. You asked me when I decided to leave. I am answering. The stars had filled the sky over the lake now. The water looked like black glass. Somewhere behind me, music drifted from a neighbor's cabin. It sounded peaceful. I sat in the living room that night and looked at your father's photograph, I said quietly. And I remember asking him something. Emily sobbed softly. What? I asked your father if this was what growing old was supposed to feel like. Nobody spoke. And then I realized something. I smiled sadly. I had spent 9 years waiting for 2 people who had already moved on. Brian's voice broke. Mom, we loved you. I know. Then why did you leave? Because love without presence starts to feel like memories. More silence. Then Emily whispered. Did you tell anyone? I looked up at the stars and smiled. Just one person. Laura. No. Who? I touched Richard's ring. Samuel Foster. Both of them became quiet. Samuel had been our family attorney for nearly 30 years. He attended Richard's funeral. He knew every birthday, every anniversary, every memory. Why Samuel? Brian asked softly. I closed my eyes and remembered the day I sat in his office holding a box of photographs and a set of house keys. Because I needed someone to help me disappear. And neither of my children knew that Samuel had already prepared everything long before they remembered I was gone. Neither Emily nor Brian spoke after I mentioned Samuel Foster. I could almost picture their faces. Confused, trying to understand when everything changed, trying to remember something they never noticed while it was happening. Mom, Emily whispered. When did you talk to Samuel? I smiled softly and looked out across the dark lake. About a year ago. A year? Brian asked. You planned this for a year? I laughed quietly. No, sweetheart. I planned it for 9 years. I simply acted on it a year ago. The truth was simple. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no argument. No screaming. No family meeting. One morning I woke up and realized I had stopped expecting the phone to ring. That frightened me more than loneliness itself. I remember sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. Richard's photograph sat beside the toaster. Morning sunlight came through the window, and suddenly I realized I had memorized silence. That was when I called Samuel. He invited me to his office that afternoon. We had known each other for 30 years. He attended Richard's funeral. He held my hand when I cried. He knew Emily and Brian when they were children. He smiled when I walked in, but his smile disappeared when he looked at me. Margaret, he said softly. You look tired. I sat down and smiled. I am not tired, Samuel. No, I am done waiting. He looked at me for a long time and then nodded. I was wondering when you would say that. Tears filled my eyes. Not because he judged me, because he understood. I brought him a box filled with photographs. Old cards, birth certificates, insurance papers, Richard's watch. Every important memory I had protected for decades. Samuel quietly listened while I explained what I wanted. I am not angry, I told him. I simply want peace. He nodded. Then let us help you find it. Over the next few months, we prepared everything. The house went on the market quietly. Most of the furniture was donated. Richard's favorite chair went to a veterans center because he would have liked that. Family photographs came with me. So did his ring. Nothing else mattered. I remember the day a young couple walked through the house. They had 2 little boys. One of them ran into the backyard laughing. His father chased him while his mother apologized. I sat in the kitchen and smiled. They looked happy. I wanted that house to belong to laughter again. Samuel handled every detail. Laura helped me pack. Neither of them asked questions. Neither of them judged me. They simply stayed beside me. One afternoon, Laura stopped folding clothes and looked at me. Do you think the kids will be angry? I smiled sadly. Probably. Does that bother you? I thought about it for a moment. No. Why not? I folded one of Richard's old sweaters and placed it inside a box. Because angry people still care enough to feel something. Laura wiped her eyes. Margaret, I hate this. I know. Then she hugged me. The last night in that house, I sat alone in the living room. I turned off the lights one by one. I touched Richard's photograph. I whispered good night. Then I locked the front door and left the keys on the counter. I did not cry. I smiled. Because for the first time in 9 years, I was no longer waiting for anyone to remember me. Back on the phone, Emily's voice trembled. Mom, why did nobody tell us? I closed my eyes and remembered the promise Samuel made before I boarded the plane. Then I whispered softly. Because Samuel promised me he would not tell you until something happened that proved I had truly become invisible to both of you. And neither of them were prepared for what that something was. Emily and Brian became very quiet after I said those words. I could hear them breathing. I could almost see them standing in the driveway of a house that no longer belonged to our family. Finally, Emily whispered, "What was it?" I leaned back in my chair and wrapped my sweater tighter around me. The Montana evenings became cold quickly. I looked at the lights from a nearby cabin and smiled. 6 months after I moved away, Samuel called me. Why? Brian asked softly. Because he wanted to know if I was sure. I remembered the conversation clearly. Samuel had called on a Tuesday morning. I was planting flowers beside the porch. He sounded sad. Margaret, he said, I need to tell you something. I laughed and asked if he finally retired. But he did not laugh. Neither Emily nor Brian have called me. I remember smiling. Why would they? Samuel sighed. Because I sent both of them letters. Silence filled the phone. Letters? I asked. Yes. He paused. Not about money. Not about the house. I simply told them you had moved and suggested they call me if they needed your new address. I stopped planting flowers and sat down on the porch steps. Did they answer? Samuel was quiet for several seconds. No. My hands started shaking. Neither one. No. I remember thanking him and ending the call. Then I sat outside for nearly an hour. Not crying. Not angry. Just thinking. Samuel called again 2 months later. Margaret, he said gently. I sent another letter. I laughed softly. Samuel, you are stubborn. Yes. Did they answer? No. I remember looking out at the lake and feeling something strange. Peace. Real peace. Because for years I blamed myself. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I called too often. Maybe I expected too much. But when Samuel told me they ignored his letters too, something changed inside me. It meant I had not imagined it. I was not needy. I was not unreasonable. I was simply forgotten. Back on the phone, Emily started sobbing. Mom, I never got any letters. Brian interrupted immediately. Neither did I. I smiled sadly. Samuel said you signed for both certified letters. Silence. Long silence. Then Brian whispered, No. Emily began crying harder. Mom, I remember now. My heart skipped. You do? I thought it was legal paperwork. Her voice broke. I was busy. I left it on the kitchen counter and forgot. Brian suddenly cursed under his breath. Mine stayed in my truck for months. Nobody spoke. Then Emily whispered, Mom, what did the letters say? I smiled softly. Just one sentence. More silence. What sentence? I looked at Richard's ring and remembered Samuel reading it to me over the phone. Your mother moved away. If you would like her address, please call me. Neither of them said anything. Then Brian started crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Like a little boy who finally realized what he lost. Emily could barely speak. Mom, Why did Samuel stop sending letters? I smiled sadly. Because I asked him to. Why? I looked up at the stars above Flathead Lake. Because after the second one, I finally understood something. Emily whispered through tears. What? I closed my eyes. I was not missing. You simply were not looking. And neither of my children knew that Samuel had one more thing waiting for them. Something he promised Richard before he died. Something neither of them were ready to hear. After I told them that I was not missing and they simply were not looking, neither Emily nor Brian spoke. I could hear both of them crying softly. Not because I wanted them to cry. I never wanted that. Mothers do not dream about teaching painful lessons. We dream about family dinners, birthday cakes, grandchildren laughing in the backyard. We dream about being remembered. Finally, Brian whispered, Mom, what did Dad ask Samuel to do? I smiled sadly. Even after all these years, Richard still had a way of surprising people. He made Samuel promise something during the last week of his life. I answered quietly. What? Emily asked. I looked up at the stars above the lake. They reminded me of that night in the hospital 12 years ago. Richard was weak, but his mind was sharp. Samuel sat beside his bed. I sat on the other side holding Richard's hand. We all knew time was short. Richard smiled at Samuel and said something I never forgot. If the kids ever stop seeing their mother, promise me you will protect her from loneliness. Samuel laughed nervously and told him he was being dramatic. But Richard shook his head. Promise me. Samuel promised. I never thought about those words again. Not until a year ago. Back on the phone, Emily began crying harder. Dad said that. Yes. He knew? No. He simply loved me. Another silence followed. Then Brian asked quietly, Mom, what is Samuel hiding? I laughed softly. Nothing terrible, sweetheart. Then what? A letter. Emily stopped crying for a moment. A letter? Your father wrote it. Neither of them spoke. He wrote 2 copies. One for each of you. Brian sounded confused. When? During his last week. I remembered Richard sitting in his hospital bed with a notebook on his lap. His hands shook. He kept crossing out words because he wanted everything to be perfect. I asked him what he was writing. He smiled and said, something for later. I never saw the letters. Samuel kept them. That was Richard's wish. Mom, Emily whispered. Why did he never give them to us? I smiled softly. Because your father made Samuel promise not to. Until when? Tears filled my eyes. Until the day both of you forgot what family meant. Silence. Long silence. Then Brian whispered, Mom, can we read them? I closed my eyes. Samuel asked me that same question 6 months ago. What did you tell him? I told him yes. Emily gasped softly. 6 months ago? Yes. Then why did he not call us? I smiled sadly. Because neither of you called him either. More crying. More silence. Then Brian said something I never expected. Mom, I do not deserve Dad's letter. Tears rolled down my face. Neither do I, sweetheart. But love is not earned. It is given. The wind moved across the lake. Somewhere behind me, I heard laughter from my neighbors gathering around a fire pit. My new friends. People who asked me how I slept. People who noticed when I was quiet. People who remembered my birthday. Then Emily whispered, Mom, can we see Samuel tomorrow? I closed my eyes and remembered what Samuel had told me 3 days earlier during our weekly phone call. He had sounded worried, tired, older, and before we ended the conversation, he said something that stayed with me. Margaret, if the children finally come looking for you, there is something they need to know. My health is not what it used to be. I took a deep breath and whispered softly into the phone. Sweetheart, there is something else you need to understand. If you want to see your father's letters, you might not have much time left. After I told them about Samuel's health, I heard something I had not heard from either of my children in years. Panic. Not panic over money. Not panic over the house. Fear. Real fear. Mom, we are going to see him first thing in the morning, Brian said immediately. Emily agreed. Please tell us he is okay. I smiled sadly. He is still working. But he is 80 years old now. Time catches all of us, sweetheart. We stayed on the phone another hour. Nobody argued. Nobody defended themselves. Sometimes grief does something strange. It removes pride. Before we ended the call, Emily whispered, Mom, I love you. I closed my eyes. Those words used to be ordinary. But after 9 years, they felt unfamiliar. I love you too, I answered. The next afternoon, Laura called me. They went to see Samuel, she said softly. How did it go? I asked. Laura became quiet. Not well. My heart sank. What happened? Samuel cried. I sat up straight. In 30 years, I had only seen Samuel Foster cry once. At Richard's funeral, Laura explained that Emily and Brian arrived early. They found Samuel in his office. Smaller, older, moving slower than before. He smiled when he saw them and said, "It took you long enough." Neither child could speak. Samuel invited them inside. Then he opened his desk drawer and placed 2 envelopes on the table. Their names were written in Richard's handwriting. Emily burst into tears immediately. Brian simply stared. Neither one touched the letters. "Open them," Samuel told them gently. Emily's hands shook. According to Laura, Richard's words were simple. He told Emily that she had always been kind, that she worried too much, that one day she would understand how lonely growing old could be. Then he wrote something that made her cry so hard she could barely breathe. He wrote, "If your mother ever needs you and I am gone, promise me she will never eat dinner alone." I covered my mouth with my hand when Laura read those words to me. Richard always worried about silly things. Or at least I thought they were silly. Brian's letter was different. Richard told him how proud he was. He reminded him that being a father was not about money or success. It was about showing up. Then he wrote, "Take care of your mother for me. I know you will." Laura paused for a second. Margaret, neither of them could stop crying. I closed my eyes. And Samuel? He sat there quietly. Then what? Then he showed them something. I frowned. What? Laura sighed. Your calendar. I froze. Richard's old calendar. Samuel had kept it all these years. Every birthday, every anniversary, every holiday. And beside each date, Richard had written little reminders. Call Mom. Family dinner. Take Margaret to lunch. Surprise the kids. Emily and Brian spent nearly an hour looking through it. According to Laura, neither one could stop crying. But then Samuel told them something that made the room go completely silent. Something he had never told anyone. Not even me. Laura's voice shook when she repeated his words. Your father knew he was dying. But he was never afraid of leaving you. He was afraid of leaving Margaret alone. Tears rolled down my face. The sun had started to rise over Flathead Lake. Birds moved above the water. Another day had begun. Then Laura whispered softly, Margaret, there is one more thing. Samuel gave them your address. I closed my eyes. Because suddenly, after all these years, I realized my children were finally coming home. And I was not sure if I was ready. For 3 days, I cleaned the cabin without really needing to. I rearranged books, folded blankets, wiped the kitchen counter twice. I even baked an apple pie, although there were only neighbors coming over later that evening. I kept telling myself I was not nervous. But after 9 years, I no longer knew what it felt like to have my children near me. On the 4th morning, I heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I froze. Through the window, I saw Brian step out first. He looked older. More gray hair. More wrinkles. Emily stepped out beside him. For a second, they simply stood there looking at the cabin. Then they saw me. Emily covered her mouth and began crying immediately. Brian lowered his head. I opened the front door. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Emily whispered, Mom. I smiled softly. Hello, sweetheart. Brian wiped his eyes and laughed nervously. You really moved to Montana. I really did. Nobody knew what to say. Then I opened my arms. And suddenly they were children again. Emily cried against my shoulder. Brian hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. We stood there together and cried for a long time. Not because everything was fixed. Not because the pain disappeared. But because love had finally found its way back. Later that afternoon, we sat on the porch drinking coffee. Emily smiled through tears. Dad would love this place. I looked out at Flathead Lake and smiled. He already does. Brian laughed softly. Samuel said you joined a book club. Every Wednesday. And yoga? Twice a week. Emily laughed through her tears. Mom does yoga. I laughed too. Badly. It felt strange hearing laughter again. Real laughter. Not memories. Not old videos. Real laughter. As the sun began to set, Emily reached into her purse and handed me something. It was Richard's letter. Mom, she whispered. I think this belonged to you. I looked at his handwriting and felt tears in my eyes. No, sweetheart. Your father wrote it for you. She shook her head. No. Brian nodded. Dad spent his whole life trying to make sure you would never be alone. We almost ruined that. But not anymore. We sat quietly. Then Brian looked at me and said something I never expected. Mom, We are selling our vacation place in Florida. I frowned. Why? He smiled. Because we want to spend holidays here. Emily nodded. No more missed birthdays. No more excuses. Tears filled my eyes. Sweethearts, you do not owe me that. Emily squeezed my hand. No, but we owe Dad. Just then my phone rang. It was Laura. I answered and put her on speaker. Well? She asked immediately. I laughed through my tears. They are here. Laura started crying. About time. Then she whispered something that made all three of us smile. Richard would be unbearable right now. He would say he told everyone this family would find its way back. Night settled over the lake. Stars appeared above the mountains. My children stayed long after dinner. They washed dishes without being asked. Brian fixed a loose board on the porch. Emily folded blankets and laughed with the neighbors. Before bed, I stepped outside alone and looked up at the sky. I touched Richard's ring and smiled. They came home, I whispered. The wind moved softly through the trees. And for the first time in 21 years since losing my husband, and the first time in 9 years since losing my children, I no longer felt invisible. I disappeared because I stopped waiting. But somehow, after I finally learned to live without being remembered, love quietly found its way back home.